John Travolta has been to more funerals than most people attend in a lifetime, and not for distant relatives or aging acquaintances. The woman he planned to marry, his mother, his 16-year-old son, his wife of nearly 30 years. 4 people he loved completely, 3 of them taken by the same disease across 4 separate decades, all of it happening to a man the public largely knows as the guy from Saturday Night Fever and Grease, the actor who danced his way into American culture and never quite left it. What doesn't get talked about enough is the sheer weight of what he's carried. Most people who experience one major loss spend years working through it, and reasonably so. John experienced his first devastating loss at 23, and then grief just kept returning, wearing the same face, asking for more. Breast cancer 3 times over, each time taking someone he'd built his life around. His first love at 41, his mother at 66, his wife at 57. In between those 3 deaths, his teenage son died suddenly during a family vacation, and an extortion attempt followed while the family was still inside their worst moment. The accumulation of it is almost impossible to absorb in a single sitting, and yet by 70 years old, John Travolta is flying his own planes, traveling with his children, and choosing actively and deliberately to enjoy his life. That shift from a man who was by most accounts just getting through days after his wife's death to someone rediscovering genuine warmth and lightness is what makes his story worth telling in full, not just in headlines, but from the beginning. The first chapter of this grief begins in 1975 on the set of a television film called The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, where John, 23 years old and just beginning to build something real in Hollywood, was cast opposite a 41-year-old actress named Diana Hyland. She was playing his mother in the film. Within a month of shooting, their friendship had shifted into something neither of them expected or planned for. John told reporters years later that he thought he'd been in love before Diana, but that he hadn't, not in any way that actually counted. She brought a kind of sophistication and emotional depth that matched what he'd been looking for without knowing it, and within weeks they were picking out houses together and talking about marriage in practical terms, not as a someday idea, but as the next real step. What Diana hadn't shared with him at first was that she'd been diagnosed with breast cancer in 1975 and had undergone a mastectomy before they ever met. When they began dating, she had genuine reason to believe the worst was behind her. John was deep into filming Saturday Night Fever at the time, the movie that would turn him into a name the whole world recognized, and their plans kept expanding alongside his career. Then her health deteriorated fast. The cancer had spread, and the timeline went from cautiously hopeful to devastating in what felt like a matter of weeks. Diana didn't know she was dying until roughly 2 weeks before the end, which meant 2 weeks to process that everything she'd planned and everything she'd hoped for was about to disappear. John flew back to Los Angeles to be with her and left behind the film that would define his entire career. Nothing about the shoot mattered against being beside her. On March 27, 1977, Diana Hyland died in his arms. He described feeling the breath go out of her. He was 23 years old. The 10 weeks that followed were the hardest of his life up to that point, though what he couldn't possibly have understood then was that this was only the beginning of cancer's presence in everything he loved. 18 months after Diana's death, while John was still finding some kind of footing again, his mother Helen was diagnosed with breast cancer. Helen Travolta was the foundation of everything he'd become. Born Helen Cecilia Burke, she'd been an actress and singer herself, had performed with a radio vocal group called the Sunshine Sisters, and had even appeared in a small role in Saturday Night Fever as a woman in a paint store, the kind of detail that says everything about the relationship between them. She later became a high school drama and English teacher, and the household she ran for her 6 children was built around music, performance, and creative work. John was the youngest of the 6, and people who knew him as a child described a sensitivity in him that made others instinctively want to look after him. Helen understood that better than anyone ever did, and she protected it. When she was diagnosed, Helen deliberately kept it from John for as long as she could. She'd watched him grieve Diana and understood what adding more weight to that would do. When she finally told him, he started visiting almost every day, sitting beside her, trying to keep her spirits from sinking. Because performance was the language they'd always shared, he would sing for her, do small musical numbers at her bedside, anything to bring some light into her worst days. None of it was enough to stop what was coming. Helen Travolta died on December 3, 1978, at 66 years old. John described what her absence left behind as a huge void, words that seem entirely insufficient for what it actually was. two of the most important women in his life gone to the same disease, less than 2 years apart. His career was also in trouble by then because the disco era that had made him famous was collapsing, his follow-up films were failing, and critics were beginning to write him off as a one-time phenomenon. Personal devastation and professional crisis arrived together in his mid-20s, and John carried both of them without the kind of public collapse that most people in his position would have had every right to show. Recovery came in slow increments through the 1980s. By 1988, while filming a movie called The Experts, John met Kelly Preston. She was warm, genuinely talented, and exactly what someone carrying his kind of history needed to find. They married in 1991 in a midnight ceremony in Paris and built a family deliberately, together, with care. Their son Jett arrived in 1992, Ella Blue in 1994, and Benjamin in 2010. John's career had also rebounded spectacularly by then, with his performance in Pulp Fiction re-establishing him as a serious actor and reminding audiences why he'd ever mattered in the first place. From the outside, it looked like someone who had survived the worst had finally reached calmer ground. It looked for a while like it might actually hold. What wasn't visible to the public was that Jett had been born with autism and suffered from seizure disorders, something the family kept almost entirely private. John structured his life around being present for his son and rarely went anywhere without him. Neighbors and friends who encountered them in the Bahamas, where the family vacationed regularly, remembered how visible the closeness between father and son was, how John built his time around Jett's needs without making it seem like a burden. He brought him everywhere, kept him close, and treated the whole arrangement as simply the shape of his life. On January 2, 2009, the family was at their vacation home in the West End Resort in the Bahamas, celebrating the new year. Jett was 16 and had experienced seizures roughly every 5 to 10 days throughout his life. The family had taken careful precautions, employed 2 nannies, installed alarms on bathroom doors. Around 10 in the morning, one of the nannies woke John and Kelly to say Jett was unresponsive on the bathroom floor. John ran downstairs immediately and began performing CPR on his son. He fought to bring him back. Jett had suffered a seizure, struck his head on the bathtub, and the injury was fatal. 16 years old, gone in the time it took for a single morning to turn wrong. What followed made everything worse. An ambulance driver and a former Bahamian senator attempted to extort $25 million from John and Kelly, threatening to release private information about Jett's death and profit from a family's grief during the worst period of their lives. John testified at a high-profile trial before eventually dropping the case, unable to keep sustaining the trauma of legal proceedings on top of everything else he was carrying. In 2010, Kelly gave birth to Benjamin, and John told reporters that the new baby had given their home a renewed spirit. He created the John Travolta Foundation to support children with special needs, and life began to move forward again, in the halting, incomplete way it always had for him. Then in 2018, Kelly was diagnosed with breast cancer, the same disease, a third time. She made the decision to keep her diagnosis almost entirely private, received treatment at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, and continued working when her health allowed. Her last film role came that year when she appeared alongside John in the movie Gotti. After that premiere, she stepped back from public life completely, and those close to the family understood why without needing it explained. John watched her go through chemotherapy and radiation, knowing exactly what that path looked like, having been beside Diana and his mother on versions of the same path in different decades. He supported her through every treatment, cared for Ella and Benjamin, tried to keep daily life as stable as possible for the children. Kelly Preston died on July 12, 2020, at 57 years old. John announced it on Instagram in a post that was plain and honest, thanking the team at MD Anderson, acknowledging the friends and loved ones who'd helped, promising to take time to be present for his children. 3 women, 3 separate decades, breast cancer each time. Diana at 41, his mother at 66, Kelly at 57. And Jett at 16 in between. In the months following Kelly's death, John started speaking about grief publicly in a way that most people at his level of celebrity never do. He said that mourning is deeply personal, that it moves at its own pace regardless of what anyone wants from it, and that after Kelly died, he'd found himself feeling saturated by other people's sadness. The love and support were genuine, but the weight of everyone else's grief sometimes crowded out his own, leaving no space for him to actually process what he was feeling. His solution was to find distance from all of it, somewhere he could grieve without interference. He described the alternative as two boats sinking together and said it doesn't help the person you're trying to support and doesn't help you either. For several years after 2020, people who knew John described him as someone going through the motions. He cared for his children, helped Ella as she began her own career in acting, raised Benjamin, kept moving. The version of him people remembered from earlier decades, that warmth and genuine visible joy, had gone much quieter. By 2024, something shifted visibly. He took Ella to the Paris Olympics, a trip that included 5-star hotels, Michelin-starred restaurants, museum visits, and sporting events, and people around him noticed a lightness that hadn't been there in years. The traveling increased, the old energy started showing up again, and the man who'd spent most of a decade in some degree of mourning was making new memories instead of just preserving old ones. He still posts tributes to Kelly on her birthday and on Mother's Day, keeping her present in the life of their family, and he's spoken openly about helping Benjamin understand that grief is natural without letting it define everything. When Benjamin expressed fear about losing his father too, John talked with him honestly, offered comfort without pretending the worry was unreasonable. That kind of steadiness in a parent comes specifically from someone who's had to navigate loss repeatedly and actually learned something from doing it. At 70, John Travolta says he's in a good emotional and physical place. He pilots his own planes, travels, spends time with people who make him laugh, and approaches his days with something that looks, from the outside, like genuine appreciation for being alive. The grief is still there, woven into everything he carries, but it no longer sets the terms of how he spends his time. He said that Kelly will always be part of his life, and that this doesn't mean he can't also enjoy living. That sentence, simple as it is, took him 40 years of loss to actually mean. 40 years of breast cancer taking people he loved, a son gone suddenly at 16, an extortion attempt during his worst grief, and still at 70 he's flying planes and finding his way back to joy. That's not a Hollywood ending. That's just a person who kept deciding one day at a time not to stop.